According to recent interviews, Diane Ravitch is happily distanced from the writing of another book and really from education reform activism on the larger scale. She's been a pillar of the American education debate for more than 40 years and has even served our country as an assistant to the Secretary of Education. She is a renowned education historian and analyst, and in her book, The Death and Life of the Great American School System, is currently a national bestseller. Her work is the clear influence of this short film, and she is given credit for opening my eyes to what's really going on in American education today. This short featurette will briefly discuss the transformation or evolution of the American education system as it has traveled through politically driven reform movements and hopes to illustrate why a Back to the Future movement should really be considered next. This film is about education reform and how in the world we got where we are today. This starts with the need for reform in the first place, and American students provided that on the results of international tests in the 1970s. As U.S. students' scores dropped, Americans had to face the harsh reality that the unthinkable had occurred. The U.S. was now behind someone else in line. In the mid-1970s, other countries were simply outproducing our youth on international testing standards. SAT scores were dropping, and the reports pointed to increased numbers of minorities taking the test, dropping the curve. Diane Ravitch suggests that if you look into the question of where our schools went wrong, where our school reform went wrong, you'll eventually wind up at a report called A Nation at Risk. This 1983 report was a response to the SAT reports suggesting a deficiency in our schools. It was prepared by the National Commission on Excellence in Education and encouraged states and the nation to craft genuine curriculum standards in many subjects. The word curriculum is of specific importance here. Essentially, this was a response to the weakening education system in the United States and suggested a number of reform concentrations, namely curriculum, or specifically what we are teaching. It was an argument essentially for national standards. Let's look quickly at what A Nation at Risk did and did not do. First, let's look at what A Nation at Risk did not do. What it didn't do was look to abolish the U.S. Department of Education. What it also didn't do was refer to market-based competition or choice between schools. They made no suggestion that the choice between schools or creating a competitive place for the schools to compete would have any positive effect. They also did not refer to closing schools or privatization or harsh regulations or penalties for schools that were struggling. And furthermore, the last point that we'll make here is that they made no efforts to express a need for the state takeover of school districts. Now, what A Nation at Risk did do was address problems that were intrinsic to schooling, issues like curriculum, higher graduation requirements, better teacher preparation, quality of textbooks and resources, and suggested higher admission requirements for colleges. Finally, and a point that we'll hit on a little bit later as well, is the professionalism of the teaching profession itself. And that is a little bit deeper subject we'll get into just momentarily. As one might imagine, a report that calls out the deficiencies of the education system will be met with a number of people who are in debate of that topic or want to jump in and cause change quickly. One of such people in 1994, a response and rebuttal basically crafted to national standards document was provided by Lynn Cheney, a last name that we all probably recognize today. In an article written in the Wall Street Journal, The End of History, Lynn Cheney basically lit a political fire that would divide and conquer anyone ready to jump on board with the suggestions of A Nation at Risk. Her suggestions that the standards had diluted history to show nothing but oppression and failure in America got political fires swirling. You can imagine the racial implications in this sort of remark and the divide that might drive politically. In any event, this article and the debate that followed were basically the end of national standards conversation. Politicians were frozen scared to touch the topic of what to teach our children and passed the buck along to the states. So, politically, national standards can't be touched. They've become a poison pill. And at the state level, things aren't much different. In fact, the topic remains a poison pill and leads states to develop extremely vague standards that can be interpreted in any number of ways. Once again, passing along any responsibility and accountability to the next level. In 2002, we are delivered legislative action by President George W. Bush in No Child Left Behind. And that is actually by itself important to recognize. A Nation at Risk was a report. No Child Left Behind was federal law. No Child Left Behind basically made testing and accountability our national education strategy. However, it had finally passed along the entirety of the responsibility onto the teachers as well, and further limited our educational focus to two skill-based subjects, math and English. With the passing of No Child Left Behind, we had officially gone from a conversation on national standards to an entrepreneurial business model approach of accountability. In the end, what we had decided education was, apparently, were test scores. It had nothing to do with the student's ability to develop knowledge, to utilize their knowledge, to do any of these things with the information they had gained. Basically, to quote Diane Ravitch, in the age of No Child Left Behind, knowledge was irrelevant. This topic clearly goes a wealth deeper than I have gone in this short film. But essentially, the conversation is about standards versus accountability and what that really means for us as a nation of educators. What remains for educators is what is referred to as constrained professionalism, meaning that you may know better, you may have a wealth of qualifying evidence and everything else that could go with your decisions logically and reasonably, a qualified rationale for your decisions in the classroom, but these will not be considered if they do not enhance test scores. Test scores are pretty much all that matters. When it comes down to it, they're the line for money. That's where states get their money from. That's where school districts are going to get their paychecks from, and they simply can't afford to not have the government help. What I would personally suggest is that this is incredibly short-sighted, that our concentration on two skills out of the multitude of things that happen in anyone's life is just incredibly narrow-scoped. Content specifically alone is not the answer. What our students need is to learn how to learn. Our students are needing information that we don't have yet. They will be entering a world of creative problem solving on a daily basis. They will be entering a world of information that is not readily available to us today, and so the ability to gain information and utilize that information is really what is paramount for our students to learn. Concentration on math and English to specifically right and wrong, black and white courses or content areas is not enough. It's simply not sufficient for the future of education and for the future of our students as they go into the real world. What this short feature would like to suggest in the end is that we go back and take another very strong look at A Nation at Risk, a report from 1983 which seemed to have a much better handle on what's necessary for the reform of education than anything we have today. There is no empirical evidence that suggests that privatization of schools, that choice in schools has any positive effect on education or even on test scores. What it has behind it is the radical notion that change is necessary, that we cannot remain behind other nations in education. That is obviously agreeable. However, what is not agreeable is that we limit these students to only these two things and that we teach solely to the test, creating an atmosphere of memorization and regurgitation that has no effect on the student's abilities to learn.